There were two historical developments in 1819 that destroyed all the unity and national unity and patriotism that united the country in the era of good feelings. One was the Panic of 1819, and the other was Missouri's bid to enter the Union as a slave state. As a result of this shattered post-war unity, what we see happening is that there was animosity and distrust developing between the north part of the country and the south part of this country. And this was some 40 years before the American Civil War. In the election of 1824, the Republican Party was so divided they could not even rally around a single candidate. I mean, the Republican Party was the only party left. And instead of rallying around a single candidate, you see that the American voters tended to support candidates that came from their section, from their region. So in today's lesson, first of all, we're going to examine these developments. We're going to examine the Panic of 1819. Why did that divide the country? We're also going to look at the controversy surrounding Missouri's bid to join the Union. And last of all, we're going to look at the very tumultuous and divisive presidential election of 1824. So let's first of all look at the Panic of 1819. The Panic of 1819 was the first time that Americans experienced the economic cycle. You know, in capitalism, you have this period of boom followed by a bust that is typical of any kind of capitalist system. And the Panic of 1819 was the first real bust after a long boom in American history. You see, what happened is that following the War of 1812, the country experienced dramatic economic expansion. And what was fueling economic expansion was cotton production. You see, the United States was producing cotton in large numbers and then exporting this cotton to Great Britain to be made into cotton cloth in their textile mills, or sending them up to American textile mills in the Northeast to be made into cotton cloth in America. Now, in this period, right after the war, American farmers and planters were moving in large numbers into the Tennessee and lower Mississippi valleys because these areas were great for cotton production. The soil was quite rich. And as they moved out west, they borrowed huge sums of money because they needed to buy land, they needed to buy tools, and in the South, of course, they had to buy slaves. Now, what triggered the economic panic of 1819 was that there was just too much cotton. So much cotton was produced that in 1819, over in Great Britain, which was America's #1 buyer of American cotton, cotton prices dropped. Whenever you have too much of something, prices drop. And when prices for cotton dropped, what that created was a situation where it was questionable whether American planters and farmers were going to be able to pay back all those loans. Remember, American farmers had gone into debt to banks so that they could grow more cotton. And now that the cotton prices were dropping, people were saying, hey, are these farmers going to be able to pay off their debts to the banks? Well, you see, that put the banks at risk because now people were questioning, well, if the banks don't get their money back, well, that will put the banks, they'll go bankrupt. They'll put the banks in trouble. So what happened is by 1819, there were fears across the nation that bank after bank was in financial trouble. So in this situation, you have what is called a panic because people would literally panic. Why would they panic? Because in those days, if a bank went out of business, anybody who had money in that bank would lose everything they had. So whenever there was news that a bank was in trouble, there would be a panic and people would literally run to the bank. It was called a run on the bank. And they would run to the bank and they would demand their money because they all wanted to get their money out before the bank went bankrupt, before the bank went out of business. So as a result of this situation, banks after bank after bank went out of business, went bankrupt as investors pulled their money out. Now, this collapse of the banking system had a snowball effect on the American economy because when banks went out of business, businesses that had money in those banks went out of, they lost large sums of money. When banks went out of business, that meant there was less credit out there. See, businesses need credit like the body needs blood. Without credit, businesses will collapse. So when the financial system began to collapse and you had a shortfall of credit, businesses were in trouble. And when businesses are in trouble, the first thing they do is they cut wages or lay off workers, because their biggest expense, their biggest cost is wages. So businesses began to lay off workers, and as a result, in towns and cities across America, the unemployment rate skyrocketed. So you had a lot of people who were unable to work, who lost work in this period. Now, as a result of the Panic of 1819, what happened is that different parts of the country began to blame one another for the economic downturn. For example, farmers and planters, remember, they were the ones who were borrowing from banks. They're the ones who were ruined because they couldn't pay off their debts. Well, many of these planters and farmers in the South and West, they blamed the banks. They blamed the banks. They said the banks were speculators. They were profiteers. They had been greedy. And so they were blaming the banks. Now, the banks were based primarily, I mean, the biggest centers of finance were in the big cities up north, like Philadelphia, New York City, Boston. Those were the centers of finance. And so people out in the West and in the South, they were pointing fingers at those Yankees up north and blaming them for the economic troubles. Meanwhile, the bankers and the investors up north were saying, well, if those Southerners weren't just, taking all this money and weren't so reckless, then we wouldn't be in this problem in the first place. Now, what made the problem even worse was the appointment of a new director to the Bank of the United States, a man by the name of Nicholas Biddle. Southern planters and farmers out west came to hate this man. In fact, in cartoons of the day, he was portrayed as the devil himself. Now, why was Nicholas Biddle so hated? Well, you see, as a director of the Bank of the United States, he wanted to make sure that there was not another financial crisis. So what he did is he demanded that all state banks that had money invested in the Bank of the United States, and almost all state banks did, what he insisted was that they keep a large amount of gold, specie, that's what it's called, gold, in their vaults. Because he wanted to make sure that they didn't lend out too much money. He was afraid that if state banks kept out letting out too much money, you'd have another financial crisis like you did before. So he wanted to keep a guard on that by insisting that they keep gold in their vaults. Remember, the loans that were issued by banks were based on the amount of gold that they kept in their vaults. So Biddle wanted to make sure that that gold was actually there. So as a result of the actions of Biddle, what we see is that Southerners were just unhappy with the Bank of the United States, which they saw as an institution that benefited people up north. And this created a situation where planters became even more, in the South, became even more angry because they felt that the Bank of the United States was too hard in its credit. They needed more easy credit because they needed secure loans so they could buy land and slaves and continue to grow their businesses. So as a result, we can see that this panic and the policies of the Bank of the United States was creating a rift between people in the North, wealthy businessmen and investors in the Bank of the United States, and Southern planters and farmers out west who thought that the policies of the bank and its hard credit policy was hurting them financially. Now, another problem we see happening was that you had a crisis when Missouri wished to join the Union in 1819. Now, when Missouri applied to Congress to join the Union, they applied as a slave state. And members of the House of Representatives from northern states, they were not happy with this, so they passed what was called the Talmadge Amendment. And under this amendment, they would allow Missouri to join the Union as long as no more slaves were allowed to enter Missouri, and they also demanded that all the children of slaves be automatically given their freedom. Now, this was a big problem because there are some 10,000 slaves already living in Missouri. And I mean, Missouri is along the Mississippi River, and in Missouri along the Mississippi River you can grow a lot of cotton. Now, this Talmadge Amendment, it was passed by the House, but it was blocked by the Senate. In the Senate, Southerners had enough vote to block it. So the Talmadge Amendment was never passed. So what we had by 1819 was an impasse, because Congress did not know what to do about Missouri, about how to allow Missouri to enter the Union as a new state. Now, in the North, generally, most Americans believed that slavery was incompatible with the principles of the American Revolution. I mean, after all, the Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal. And back in 1787, the Continental Congress had, in the Northwest Ordinance, had actually banned slavery from the Northwest Territory. Now, this territory included a lot of states in what is today the Midwest, like Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. And so in these states, there was never any slavery. Now, in addition to that, some of the more distinguished founding fathers, like Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton, had even been publicly opposed to slavery and denounced it as immoral. So in 1819 and 1820, you had a lot of Americans up north who thought, why should we add a new slave state to the Union? We need to get rid of that institution, and no need to add it to a Union as a slave state. So that was the case of the North. So in the North, they wanted Missouri to enter the Union as a free state. But in the South, they had a very, very different perspective. You see, in the South, the rise of the cotton industry had really reinvigorated the institution of slavery. See, back in 1793, a man by the name of Eli Whitney had invented the cotton gin. Now, what the cotton gin did was it made it easier to process raw cotton. It got rid of the seeds that were in raw cotton, so it made it easier to turn cotton into thread and into cloth. So the cotton gin had really boosted cotton cloth production, and that created a huge demand for cotton, not only in America but overseas, because all these overseas in Great Britain and in the American Northeast, mills were busy turning raw cotton and cotton into cloth. Now, what made cotton production very, very profitable was cheap land. As long as you had land that was cheap, you could go out there and you could grow cotton. Another key reason for the profitability of cotton was slaves. So cheap land and slave labor made it so that cotton producers in these very rich farmlands of the South could grow cotton and make huge sums of money. So Southerners were afraid that if slavery was stopped in Missouri, this would set a dangerous precedent, and it might lead to other states in what had been the Louisiana Territory being added to the Union as free states and not as slave states. And that would put an end to all the cheap land. And they were afraid that if free states eventually came to outnumber slave states, then it might get to the point where there'd be enough support in Congress to actually get rid of slavery altogether. And that's one thing that planters and slave owners did not want to see happen. So there was a tremendous outrage, and there was all kinds of finger pointing, and it was very much a huge crisis. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, who was still alive at the time, he even said that he saw this issue of slavery being something that would destroy the Union. He was prophetic in that regard. And now eventually, after a lot of talk, the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, came forward with what is known as the Missouri Compromise. You know, Henry Clay is sometimes known as the Great Compromiser because he worked so hard to try to bring different parties together. Now, under the Missouri Compromise, it was agreed that Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state in 1821. It was also agreed that Maine, now Maine was part of Massachusetts, but in 1821 Maine was separated from Massachusetts and entered the Union as a free state. So now you had one slave state, Missouri, one free state, Maine, and the idea was there'd be a balance of power. There'd be a balance between the number of free states and the number of slave states in the Union. Now, it was also agreed as part of the Missouri Compromise that the southern border of Missouri, the 3630 line, this line was to be extended out west. And the idea would be that states north of that 3630 line would enter the Union as free states, and states south of that 3630 line would enter the Union as slave states. Now, this Missouri Compromise seemed to satisfy both sides for the time being, and as a result, many people give it credit for putting off the Civil War for 40 years. But even with the compromise, there was still a lot of tension in the air, a lot of fear and a lot of distrust between the North and the South. Now, in the election of 1824, as the country was now divided by sections, the candidates that ran for office in that year tended to represent sections of the country. The candidates that were most successful had the most support from the region from which they came. Now, one of the front runners in the campaign was John Quincy Adams. Remember, he had been the Secretary of State. He had the endorsement of James Monroe. Now, he was an economic nationalist. He believed in the Bank of the United States. He supported the bank and its hard credit policies. He believed in high tariffs to promote manufacturing. He believed in federal spending for road and canal construction. And there are a lot of business interests up in New England, where he was from, that supported him. So he had a lot of support in New England, which happened to be his native land. Now, opposing Adams early on, another front runner was a man by the name of William Crawford of Georgia. He was a Southerner. And early on in the campaign, a lot of Southern planters really supported Crawford. And he came out against the Bank of the United States. You know, being a Southerner, he didn't like the bank. He argued the same arguments that Jefferson had made years earlier, that the Bank of the United States was basically unconstitutional. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson, who was in retirement at his home in Monticello, Thomas Jefferson came out and endorsed Crawford for the presidency. So Crawford was seen as a front runner, along with John Quincy Adams. Now, a man who came in late into the race was Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. Now, he originally didn't have any intention to run, but he was drafted by the Tennessee State Legislature. They came forward and they nominated him, and he was a war hero and an Indian fighter, and a lot of folks out west, Western farmers, remember Tennessee was a Western state back then, a lot of Western farmers saw Andrew Jackson as their man, a man who fought against Indians, defended them against what they viewed as savages. Now, last candidate was Henry Clay of Kentucky. Now, Kentucky was a rural state, it was a slave state, but Henry Clay actually was in full agreement with Adams. See, even though his state was agrarian, he wanted to see America as a whole become a nation of trade and industry and commerce, and he was in agreement with Clay, but of all the candidates, he had the least support among his home region. Now, in 1824, no surprise, Clay, who had the least support from the region, he got the least amount of votes. So he ended up dead last in the campaign. Now, Crawford, remember, he had been an early front runner. He got sick. Many people think he suffered a stroke. He fell ill. He was unable to campaign, and as a result, he finished third. Now, Adams, he had strong support up in New England, and he finished second. He had 84 electoral votes. Now, to the surprise of everybody, the guy who won the most votes was Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. He had the most electoral votes of all. He had 99 electoral votes. A lot of Southerners, maybe because he was a slave owner, they switched their vote over to him. Actually, during the campaign, Jackson didn't even have an agenda, but maybe because he was a slave owner, maybe some of the Crawford supporters voted for him instead. Now, since no candidate had a majority of votes in the Electoral College, the election went to the House of Representatives, just like the election of 1800 had gone to the House of Representatives. And now, when it went to the House of Representatives, John Clay decided to withdraw from the race. Now, he did that because that allowed him to exercise his position as the Speaker of the House. He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Now, many people think that he used his influence in Congress to ensure that his supporter and friend, John Quincy Adams, was elected president. So the House of Representatives voted to elect John Quincy Adams as president. Now, he didn't get the popular vote. He didn't even get the most electoral votes. But he was elected president by the House of Representatives. And basically, Clay and Adams were in agreement in terms of their policy, so it made sense. Now, what happened next, though, was one of the first things that Adams did was that he appointed Clay to be Secretary of State. Basically, what he was saying was he was endorsing Clay as his successor by making him Secretary of State. Now, when Jackson heard about this, he was livid. I mean, he denounced this. He felt that this was wrong. He felt that Clay and Adams had been in collusion with one another, that they had made what he called a corrupt bargain. You know, I scratch you back, you scratch mine, and that these two men had worked together against the will of the American people. And so that got fired up Andrew Jackson. He was determined to run for president again and campaign for president in the next election in 1828. Now, when he ran for president in 1828, that would start a whole new era, the Age of Jackson, a whole new era in American history. And that's what we're going to look at in our next lesson.